Welcome everyone. Welcome to this key webinar, which is on practical tips to speed up UI automated tests. Let me welcome Julia Pottinger. Julia is the head of training and development at QualityWorks. She's a big advocate of work-life balance and spends time with her loved ones. Julia is very passionate about sharing her knowledge and experience and contributes to the testing community through writing articles, YouTube videos, delivering testing courses, conducting testing boot camps for persons entering into the testing field. It's an honor to have you, Julia. Do subscribe to her YouTube channels. I have been following them and her blogs. They're really insightful, so don't miss to catch hold of them. So welcome, Julia, and thank you for accepting our invite and choosing to talk for the Q community. So the stage is yours, Julia.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. Welcome to the webinar on practical tips to speed up your UI automation. My aim is to share with you tips on how to increase the speed of your UI test, make your tests more efficient, and how to make your UI tests less flaky. I am Julia Pottinger. I am from the beautiful island of Jamaica where I work and live. It is sunny all year round and we have beautiful beaches, great food. I am the head of training and development for QualityWorks, and that is a QA and agile transformation company. In my role, I organize and deliver trainings in different formats, as well as create career or learning paths for our different consultants so that they are continuously upskilling. In the last year, we've had over 12 full-day workshop sessions on topics such as performance testing, accessibility, test automation, AI, CI/CD. I love sharing my knowledge and learning with others. You can find me and connect with me on different platforms. I am on Twitter at iluge876, LinkedIn as Julia Pottinger. I have a WebDriver IO course on Test Automation University. That is a great platform if you want to learn more about test automation and different programming languages. I blog about test automation, WebDriver IO, and a bit of development on juliapottinger.com. And I also create videos on these same topics at youtube.com/Julia Pottinger. Now, I have defined UI automation as a testing process that are executed using an automated tool to access and interact with the graphical user interface. With the graphical user interface, you're getting visual representations such as buttons, icons, and you communicate with these icons using the mouse or keyboard, rather than the text-based or command-based type of communication. You use this to get some things done or to perform some type of function. The graphical user interface is what you interact with. For example, if you're going to be using Amazon to purchase an item, you're using Spotify to update your playlist, you're logging in using Google or Facebook. There are various steps that you would take to carry out or complete either of those tasks. With UI automation, you're creating a script to carry out those actions for you. This action requires interaction with the browser. Its elements to perform actions such as click, enter text, scroll, amongst others, to verify the functionality of the application. Now, UI automation can be done on the web or on mobile devices. Overall, with verifying the quality of an application, you can include test automation at various levels. We have the test automation pyramid, and it talks about 3 different levels, including how they should be used, the frequency at which you include test automation in your strategy. End-to-end testing is at the top of the pyramid, and it's recommended that you have less of these types of tests. Integration is in the middle, and you should have more integration tests than you have end-to-end tests. And then unit tests should be the most types of tests that you have automated. That's the recommendation based on the test automation pyramid. A unit test focuses on testing very small components or one single piece of functionality of the code base. You want to validate that single functionality or unit behaves as expected. In isolated conditions, your unit test normally runs fast and quick. However, unit tests alone aren't enough to ensure the quality of the code base. So next, we would include our integration tests. This is the next level of the pyramid. It's in the middle. This means it should not appear as often as your unit tests, but you should ensure that components work together. Check that internal components work along with external components. Databases are a very common dependency in software development, APIs as well, and these would fall into your integration tests. Then at the top of the pyramid, we have end-to-end tests, and UI automation falls in the end-to-end test category. Now, end-to-end tests are considered slower, more fragile, because they have a large variety of user scenarios. The UI of the application can change and will change. Locators are going to change, and these can cause failures. End-to-end automation also requires communication with other dependencies, and this will increase the time and may cause bottlenecks in your tests. Given that UI automation is a part of end-to-end tests that are slow and take longer to run when compared to integration and unit tests, how do we speed up our UI tests? I'm going to share with you some tips that I have used to speed up my UI tests. You can let me know in the chat whether or not you currently use these tips in your project, or if you have additional tips that I did not mention at the end of the presentation. The first tip is to use different layers of the application to aid your tests. The API layer of an application executes commands 35 times faster than the UI layer and can be used in the following ways to speed up the automated test that you're executing. You can use APIs to set up state needed for your tests. The state needed for test automation can be created quickly using an API. For example, if it is you want to spin up a certain number of users with specific profile features, you can use the API to generate those users much more quickly than if you were going to go. Then if you're going to the UI, you're going to log in, navigate to the page, and create those users and their profile individually. You're going to have to do that 10 or 100 different times based on the number of users that you want to create. If you're doing it via the API, it's going to save a whole lot of time. You can probably just do one API call and it will create those 10 or 100 types of users with different profiles for you. Also, if you go to the UIs, it's going to be prone to errors because you're risking doing that same action over and over. The internet may be slow, the GUI may take a long time to load, and this is overall going to affect the speed. So in order to set up state that you would need for your test, consider using the API instead of going through the GUI. With APIs, you can also do cleanup. Now, cleanup via API can help speed up your automation tests. Remember that an API is going to run 35 times faster than doing a test on a GUI. So if your test on the GUI takes a minute, your API test is going to be 35 times faster than that. So if you set up your UI test on the API, that's going to save you time. If you do cleanup, it's going to also save you time. Now, let's say the scenario that we mentioned before, where you have created 10 or 100 users. Let's say for each of those users, we added 10 items to their carts. That now has changed the state of the application. You may want to then go in and do a next test that may be affected by those steps that you have carried out before. Instead of going in manually, signing into each user profile on the GUI and deleting each item out of their cart if they don't have a remove all button, you can do an API call to delete all the items out of the user's cart and then to delete the user profile if you need to do so. This is a cleanup step that can be done very quickly with a call or two via the API. APIs can also be used for verification. Now, test verification helps us to determine whether the application successfully passed or failed based on the actions that we just carried out. You can make a call to verify that a user was created, verify that purchases were made. So instead of going to the GUI and after you've registered a user, you are going to try to log in or try to go to the email of the user, you can make an API call to get back if the user is now created, does the user exist? You can also make API calls to check that purchases were made. So some things can be done in the API layer versus in doing UI test. Overall, select tests that are best done in the API layer. For UI, you don't have to do everything step by step. What you can do is maybe do visual regression testing to ensure that the UI of the application still functions as it should. However, bring certain things to the API level. The next step is to use the database. Now, in the same way that we talked about using the API layer to speed up the UI tests, we can also use the database. You can set up the state needed for your test, perform cleanup, verification logic, and with databases, you can query for data that meets specific criteria. In a particular project that I have been on, I have used database queries to find specific types of users that I needed for my test to execute in certain conditions. So there was a project where we were selling flowers for persons that have passed. There were different business logic per funeral home, as well as the death date for the individual. So if a person had passed within a week, there would be different things on the screens. There would be different logic versus somebody that had passed in a month or a year. So based on those conditions, I would need to find a specific type of user for that time period. And also there were funeral homes that had unique placements of things on the screen, unique call to actions, etc. That meant that I would need to test for each of these unique conditions. Now, what I would do, I would use the database to get users and query for users in a particular funeral home with a particular death date. Using that result, I would then be able to generate a URL that took me directly to the person's death page. And then that would allow me to seamlessly carry out my test. If I had not done that query, I would have had to navigate to the home page of the site, search for the funeral home, wait for that to come up, then filter for persons who had passed under the time that I wanted to look for, and then click on the person and wait for the page to load. That would have taken so much more time than doing that database query, creating that URL, and then going directly to it. If you add this technique to other tests that have similar conditions, that time adds up and you can save so much more time by using the database in this way. Managing test setup and teardown is useful for unique scenarios where users or the data need to be in a specific state before tests can be executed. Setup is important to ensure that your end-to-end test performs in the same way every time your team or your CI pipeline execute them. You will have specific tools that you can use to do setup and teardown. However, it's important that you use them properly. So setup should be done before your test run. If you have a large database, you want to set up before to ensure that your environment, data, and users are in the right format. And you want to do teardown after a suite of tests. You don't want to do teardown after each test so that after each test, you have to set up again. So you set up at the very beginning before your test suite, and then you tear down as needed. So you don't tear down after each test, because then the things that you would have set up would be erased and you would have to do that action over again. The next step is parallel execution. Now, test automation can be run sequentially, that is one after the other. However, if you use parallel execution, you can vastly improve the speed of your automated tests. Parallel execution allows you to run multiple automated tests at the same time. Therefore, you're going to have multiple browsers open and you're going to see more of your test suite being run at the same time. If you have a login suite, a checkout suite, and a search or filter suite, instead of waiting for the login suite to finish and then you run the checkout suite and then you run the filter suite and so on, you can have all three suites running at the same time. Most test automation frameworks allows you to control the number of sessions that are created and therefore the number of parallel execution that happens. So you may have 2 sessions, you may have 3, you may want to have 5. It all depends on the types of tests that you have, the different suites, and how you want your groupings to be done. The benefits of this is that it cuts down on the time you take to run your entire test suite, your entire test. So if you have tests that were taking 10 minutes to run, if you decide to do parallel execution and you split it into 2 sessions, then that should mean your tests are now going to take half the time. It's going to take 5 minutes to run. And if you increase the number of parallels, then it's going to continue to reduce the time that your tests take to run. Now, this is very helpful if you test across multiple devices, such as mobile devices or different browser combinations. You could have parallel executions per browser. So you have your same test suite, but it's testing on Google Chrome, your same test suite, but it's testing on Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer, etc. So that would mean you have 4 different sessions if you're testing on 4 browsers, and that time would be reduced compared to running all of those one by one and then switching browser. Same applies if you're running your mobile automation and you want to test it on different things. What you have to keep in mind with parallel execution is that there may be some tests that have dependencies. I normally use WebDriver IO, and it provides me with an option that I can use to run my parallel tests. So it gives me a specification that says these tests can't be running parallel as they are dependent on another test and must be run together. So if you have tests that are dependent and if they don't run together or if they don't run in the same session, it will cause failures. Frameworks have different guidelines that you can use to group those tests. So you need to understand how your tests are set up, what can be run in parallel, what dependencies it have. So in this WebDriver IO example, if I grouped certain cases, then they will run sequentially in that single instance. So even if I say I want to run my test in parallel and I want to have 10 sessions, that is, I want to spin up multiple sessions, it's going to respect the grouping that I had stated. If I say I need my register test suite and my login test suite because I have to register a user before I try to log in with it, then it's going to respect that. And so register and login will open in that one session and will be run one after the other. So think about how your tests run concurrently and ensure that you are not causing failures because you do not group certain tests that need to be grouped. But overall, if those tests don't have that sort of dependency and you can do parallel, it will increase the speed at which your UI automation runs. Now, the next one is distributed execution, and it's similar to running them in parallel. This is where your tests are executed across many different virtual machines or computers in the cloud. Cloud services such as Docker provides the option to spin up various servers, various environments that you can use to execute your tests. Generally speaking, end-to-end tests or UI tests are heavy processes and they can sometimes take up a lot of computing power. Or sometimes when you're running your test locally, it just takes up the screen space on your computer if you are just using one monitor and you want to do something else. So if you have it distributed, then it kind of takes that work off your computer. Distributed execution in the cloud is going to enhance the speed of your tests. Machines are more powerful, they have more memory, they have more space, and it allows you to run in parallel as well. Therefore, the same things that I talked about in parallel applies here. Your tests will run faster. Distributed execution also removes the management of servers and browser versions. It eliminates the time that you will need to set up new environments. So those environments can be set up on these machines or resources in the cloud. And these cloud services will update whenever there's a new mobile phone, there's a new operating system. So you don't have to physically go out and buy a new laptop or get that new browser. Overall, parallel and distributed execution is going to help you speed up your test and distributed execution will help you eliminate the need to set up those new environments locally. If you have ever run your test in a CI pipeline, that is a continuous integration pipeline, that could be GitHub Actions, Bitbucket, Jenkins, Travis CI, etc., then there is a very high probability that your UI tests are being executed headlessly. Now, browser automation can be done on a headed browser. That is the browser that we're used to. It has a GUI. You interact with it using clicks. It has buttons, text fields, etc. Or you can use a headless browser. Now, a headless browser operates in the same way that you would expect a normal browser to, but it does not have a graphical user interface. So when you're running these tests, you will not see the browser GUI pop up and the actions being carried out. So you won't physically get to see it log in, navigate to the dashboard, do a checkout, but it will be done. Interactions with a headless browser are done via the command line interface, and it doesn't require a visible UI. Because of this, it makes headless tests way faster than on UI browsers, because it doesn't have to wait for certain graphical user interface elements to load. And it also uses less memory. When running tests in parallel, UI-based browsers utilize a lot of memory, and therefore, when you're running it on a headless browser, it's going to use less memory. Now, headless browsers are not only faster, but they're very useful when you are executing on a server that doesn't have a GUI. This is the case with most cloud-based servers that I mentioned before. If you're going to run it in a CI pipeline, then they won't have a headed browser, and so you'll have to run it headlessly. As with all the tips that I have shared and will share, you need to be careful and think about your own situation. So some application features may not work as expected on a headless browser. So you have to run it and ensure that it's working properly. Headless browsers aren't mimicking the exact user behavior, and some tests may fail due to the speed at which they're being executed, because it's going to be executing faster on a headless browser than a headed browser. And regular users aren't using a website in headless mode. So you need to also, while doing headless automation, in your entire test strategy, run scenarios manually, do exploratory testing, do visual regression, do other forms of testing on a headed browser, check for the user experience. You want to ensure that the functionality of the website, user experience remains consistent. We've talked about how APIs and databases can be used to create a specific environment that you want for your test. Using APIs, databases, data files, custom functions, and other test techniques to manage test setup and teardown, it's really going to impact the speed of your UI test. Now, create setup steps to execute and create the perfect scenarios needed for your tests. This is useful for unique scenarios where user or data need to be in a specific state before you can begin to execute your test. You don't want to be setting up that scenario on the GUI. That is going to take more time. You want to use other layers. You want to use other means to do the setup work, so that when you're actually running your test, you just need to do the verification of the specific functionality that you're checking for. So think about how and when you do setup and teardown. Teardown helps to revert the changes made during your test, so that the modified data can be returned to the normal state or pre-existing state, and it does not adversely affect future tests. I recommend that you do teardown after specific scenarios that need them, or at the end of an entire test suite instead of every test. Now, setup and teardown takes some planning, but if you plan it and do it correctly, then it will improve the speed at which your UI automation runs. Now, cookies, nice treat, but in the world of web, cookies allow browsers to track, personalize, and save information about each user session. Without cookies to streamline the user experience, you will have to log in again after you leave a website, or recreate a shopping cart if you accidentally close the page. That would not be fun. No, cookies are an important part of the internet experience. They allow for session management, letting you know login information and preferences. Have you ever logged in and you're like, keep me logged in for 30 days, and you take that option. And when you go back, you don't have to enter your username and password again. You just go straight into the application. Cookies are also important and used for personalization so that you can get custom advertisements, and they're also used for tracking. If you go on a shopping site and you previously viewed an item, next time you go there, you may get it as a suggestion of things you may be interested in or things you may like or previously view. It helps to enhance the online shopping experience. It gives you things that you may be interested in. Cookies used in web automation can make your UI test faster. It does that by using the information stored in the cookies, such as logging information, to preload test scenarios. So if you don't want to log in every time via the GUI, if you're doing a specific test, you can use cookies based on how your application is set up to preload that login information so that when you go to the URL, you are just automatically logged in, and that would skip the login step for you. If you're working on a project, like I have worked on projects where there are feature flags, A/B testing, and that means that every time you load the browser, you may get version A or you may get version B. And automation sometimes is coded for one specific version based on what you're running, or it may be coded for the next. So if you're testing a website that has feature flags or A/B version running, cookies can be helpful to speed up that instead of trying to guess which version of the application will be there. You can turn off feature flags using cookies. You can turn off those specific features so that your test will know at all time, this is the specific scenario that I'll be getting. I'll be getting scenario A or I'll be getting scenario B. So by storing information, turning on and off features, tracking and saving information about user sessions, you can use cookies to manipulate the state of the UI and increase the speed of your tests. Now, ACCELQ has command libraries that talks about cookies, and there are different test automation frameworks from low code to traditional test automation that have options that allow you to manipulate and interact with the cookie. So here's a next example of a framework. Selenium WebDriver, it has a command called add cookie. This is used to add a cookie to the current browsing context. It accepts a set of defined JSON objects, and it shows you examples in Java, Python, C#, Ruby, JavaScript, and Kotlin, which are the languages that Selenium WebDriver supports. You just need to be on the domain that the cookie will be valid for. You can preset cookies before starting interaction with your site. Once your site loads, these cookies will be there. You can also manage different cookies, and there are other commands that you can look for on Selenium WebDriver IO to manage cookies. Other frameworks such as WebDriver IO also have these commands. All right, so WebDriver IO allows you to set cookies, and it allows you to set cookies for the current page. So you can pass in a cookie object, you can pass in an object array, name of the cookie, the value of the cookie, the domain the cookie is visible to, whether or not the cookies are secure, etc. So it details how you go about setting those different cookies. So as I mentioned, you can set in login cookies, different user sessions, different things that you want enabled or disabled. But look at the specific test automation framework that you're using, see how you can integrate cookies into your test automation and speed up your UI tests. Now, the next tip is to use navigation shortcuts. So we've talked about a lot of things. This is the final tip that I'll share today. And these tips are by no means exhaustive. There are other tips out there that you may use that you'll hear people say they use to speed up their UI automated tests. But use navigation shortcuts. If I decide to navigate directly to uiautomation.com/profile/edit, It's going to be much faster than if I navigate to uiautomation.com, click login, click profile, and then click edit. Going directly is one navigation instead of navigating and doing a complete process before you get to that page. Now, with doing navigation shortcuts, utilize all the different things that I talked about before, setting up APIs, setting up database to create a login on the ready, using cookies to preload that login information so that you can just go directly to that page and you're already logged in if you need to be. Use all the different things. They can be used to your advantage instead of using the GUI to go through that long process that's going to add more time to your test. If you're doing a workflow test, then that may be different. If you want to do a workflow on the GUI to ensure that things are working in that specific order, or if you're doing visual regression, then that's different. You probably don't want to do navigation shortcuts. But if you're just checking for the edit functionality, then you don't need to be logging in, going to the dashboard, etc. You just want to check for the specific edit functionality. And all of these things are going to result in your test automation being so much faster. In addition to these tips, overall, when doing test automation, you want to ensure that you create atomic, non-repeating tests. You don't want to have the same scenarios running over and over. That's going to add time and it's going to be unnecessary. You'd want to have just the scenarios that you need. You don't want to have login being repeated over and over in multiple places. Instead, you can use cookies, navigation shortcuts to reduce that. You don't want to have a very long suite that's going to take a long time to run, be more prone to things not working, and be more prone to just failures overall. Keep your tests really small, focus on the specific thing that you're trying to verify. Use other layers of the test automation pyramid, use UI automation just to verify the things that you need to. Let's do a quick recap. So use the API layer, database layer, other functionalities to manage test setup and tear down. You want to ensure that you create that specific environment, the specific data you need before you run your UI test. Use cookies to create user login, modify the UI state that you need. Use navigation shortcuts instead of going through an entire scenario just to verify one thing. Go directly to that URL. This will save you some time. Use headless browsers. Headless browsers are faster than GUI browsers, but bear in mind there may be features that do not work as expected. So test it out, see how it works, and then include it. Do parallel and distributed execution. Distributed execution allows you to use cloud platforms, prevents you from setting up the environment. All of these different environments are available in the cloud platform. This parallel execution is going to allow you to run your test suite in a much faster way than if you were to run them sequentially. You don't have to just create one instance. You can create many concurrent instances for your test, but be mindful of tests that has to run sequentially, and they may have other dependencies. Overall, tear down your data properly, tear down the specific things that you have done properly so that future tests don't waste time, don't fail, and only tear down when you have completed your test suite so that you don't have to do unnecessary setup. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot and that you can take these tips and apply them to your different test automation projects and that you will see the speed of your UI tests improve. Let's stay connected. You can follow me on Twitter at iloj876. I'm on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and I blog at juliapottinger.com. I'll now take some questions.
So while we take more questions, I would definitely want to hear on the chat what was the special thing that you liked and what is your takeaway for this particular webinar. Anything which you learned new, anything which was special in terms of exceeding your tests, put that in the chat. So while we had questions running and people putting it in the chat what they particularly liked about this webinar. So Julia, I have to ask you one question. So you mentioned in the start the best way to understand APIs, in faster test automation is to use APIs. So what do you think is the best way to find these APIs or to leverage APIs in projects? Because normally when we get to test, we just get the product as a whole. So what kind of
Yeah.
approaches do you do to explore around these items?
So you can ask developers if they have APIs that they use to connect the front end of the application to. You can also inspect and check the network that's happening, because you will see those network calls. You'll see that it makes a call and it gets back a 200 or it gets back a 400, and you can use that information to then go to the actual developer and say, hey, I see where these calls are happening. Do you have that API? Or maybe they have a Postman collection that they can share with you that you can then use in your project.
So just a follow-up to this particular question, Siddharth asked how to pre-fill login credentials in the UI. Any experience using something like
So
this?
you're asking how to do login credentials in the URL.
Correct.
It depends on how your project is set up, but you can sometimes append to the URL. So if you have uiautomation.com, you can press question, you can use question mark login equal username and password equal password. So there is a specific ID that the application will be looking for to stipulate that it's the username. So you'd use that and put equal the username and the specific thing for password. In most time it's username equal Julia and password equal password 123. But it's a question mark that you would append to the end of the URL that would allow you to pre-fill that. It may not work for all browsers because sometimes it may be set up for security purposes, etc. But you can ask the developer on your project if that's something that will work for your specific project. But that's how you would do it.
Yeah. So Manjunath asked how to handle synchronization issues to handle complex end-to-end scenarios. What is the best approach to handle this?
Synchronization issues. So you have to evaluate. So synchronization, that is, let's say you have two things running and they clash, or I was talking about if you have tests that are dependent on each other. So it depends on your test automation framework and how the solution that they give you for it. So I showed a solution where WebDriver IO allowed me to group those tests so that at no point in time will they run without each other. Every time they will run in that specific order that I have stated. So it's based on what the scenario is and what test automation framework you're using and how they allow you to solve for it. So I can't really just throw out an answer because it's all context dependent. But one solution that I have used is WebDriver IO grouping of test suites or a grouping of tests so that I know I won't have those issues because those tests will always run together.
So just to add on, like you also mentioned about using headless browser mode for running your test to execute it faster. Apart from the advantage of it being running really fast, do you think it's a best mode if there are some issues or when you're using debugging or when you want to debug? Do you think the headless mode is a preferred option at that time?
No, if you're doing debugging, use a headed browser. But if the issue occurs, so let's say you're running your test and it fails headlessly, but it doesn't fail when you're using the regular GUI browser, then you'll have to debug in that headless browser. But if it fails on both, then I would suggest you debug it in the headed browser because you can see better, you can do browser pauses, see where it fails, check logs, etc. So I find it better to debug in a headed browser. But if the issue is occurring in the headless browser, then you have to try your best to debug there. And debugging there is a bit more difficult because you aren't able to see exactly what's happening on the screen.
So there's another question from Siddharth. He says, can cookies be used to store information in case of mobile app testing? Any idea?
I have never used cookies in mobile automation, but I think mobile apps should have cookies as well. But I personally have never used it. So that's probably something for us to research. But I have used it on web applications. But I would assume that mobile automation does allow you to use cookies as well.
So I think that answers that. Julia, you also mentioned about tear up and tear down, right? Having the right setup in terms of tear up and tear down. In terms of your experience working with a lot of automation scripts, could you help the participants know uh, what you need to consider in terms of when you set up your tear up scripts or tear down scripts? Would you want to
Yeah.
shed more light there?
Yeah. So there are before all and after test steps that you can include this in. So if I'm going to be doing setup, I can do it before all tests or I can do it before each test. So I need to determine which one of those I want to put it in. If it's something where I need to populate a database with a certain set of users, I'm probably going to do that in my before all test. If it's something where I need to log in, then I'm probably going to do it before each test because sometimes the test will create new sessions, so you'll have to log in each session. So think about the type of testing and whether or not it's a before all or before each. Same with after or after all. So after would run it after each test. You may not want that to happen. So I wouldn't want to clear back out my database after each test because that would mean then I have to set it back up, and that's going to waste a lot of time. I would probably want to connect to the database, clear it out, or maybe connect to an API, delete some things from the cart after my entire suite has been done.
One more thing in terms of, now most of us are moving to continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now, where do you see the role of UI test? Do you think a considerable of UI tests are going to still be needed and helpful in the CI/CD pipeline? What is your recommendation there in terms of speeding up automation in that pipeline?
So in the pipeline, more than likely, as I mentioned, it's going to be run headlessly. So it's going to get that speed just because of how the servers work. I think UI tests are still important in the UI because in the CI pipeline, because you don't just want unit tests, you want integration tests as well as your API databases, because that's going to the CI pipeline, the way some persons have it set up is that it's going to automatically deploy to production. So you want to maybe get a URL and test from that. So CI/CD platforms can be set up where it generates a temporary URL for your automated test to run before it gets deployed, and then that temporary URL gets deleted. So UI tests are still important in the CI pipeline because you want to check for those things. Visual regression testing are a part of UI automated tests that you can include so that it runs as well. And this is going to help check if elements are overlaying each other, if things have the wrong color, if things are not clickable, that sort of thing. So these are all important to still be done in the CI pipeline.
And you also mentioned, setting up a proper parallel and a distributed execution will help speed up. So, what are the considerations you need to take when you're setting up this distributed execution? Is there anything that you keep in mind in terms of which browsers to run on, how many threads you want to run in parallel? Do you have any recommendations when setting up a distributed run?
So I normally use data for the specific project I'm on. So which applications are most used? Maybe historical data. I am finding more bugs on this particular browser or operating system. So therefore I need to keep an eye out for it. Also, sometimes distributed platforms, they may have a cost. So if you use that data and this maybe is out of budget, you can only do it for the ones that are needed. So if most of the users use Chrome, if most of the bugs were found on iPhone, then you want to maybe just keep those two things in the distributed environment. And then the same distributed environment, if you add parallel to it, the same considerations for if tests are dependent on it, or if you have synchronization issues, you need to be aware of that in the same manner on a distributed platform.
So we talked a lot about how we can speed up, the runs time. Any recommendations? Like, there has always been an issue in terms of maintaining our scripts, right? So do you have any suggestions on how you should structure your framework, or how you should structure your automation, so that like, we're going to include API, we're going to include a lot of database scripts, but how can we make sure they are sustainable and maintainable in the long run?
Yeah, so we talk about page objects, and page objects keep the functions and it keeps the locators, but also folder structure is important. If I go into your test automation suite, the folder name should be descriptive. It should tell me exactly, say, okay, this is where I have my API functions, this is where I have my database functions. You probably want to have environment variables as well, and an env file that is going to store private credentials. So if you have API keys, if you have database logins, those are going to be stored there. If you're doing integrations with something else and you have credentials, you store those there so that those aren't pushed to the repository. And just overall structure of your project so that it's easy to read, easy to understand, separation of concerns. You don't want your test to have kind of the API call. You probably want that to be a separate function because it's going to be used by multiple tests. So instead of rewriting that API call over and over, you just call that function and maybe pass in the parameters that you need.
So yeah, we are almost 5 minutes left. So I'll just like to ask, one question, right? For someone who is going to start off, I think you have suggested a lot of suggestions in terms of speeding up, right? In terms of using APIs, in terms of using databases, using parallel distribution. So what should one look when he or she starts off automation, right? When should they actually look at all of these considerations? Do you think they should target the API first, or what exactly should be the flow according to you or your experience if someone is starting into automation?
Yeah. First, I think you should do some exploratory testing to understand the business logic, understand the dependencies. In understanding dependencies, you'll get to know whether or not APIs are being used, what type of databases are used. Is it SQL, no SQL? Is it Postgres? Are they using AWS? Are they using S3? All of that. So you get to understand what makes up, was it built on React? Are they using Express APIs? Are they using it GraphQL? Is it a regular REST API? So because those things are going to affect the types of API calls that you make, the types of database calls that you make. So first, do some exploratory testing, understand the project. Then you can decide, is it going to be best for me to just write my test automation how I would really write them, or it doesn't make sense for me to try to connect to this database. Maybe the database is difficult to connect to. You probably need to be behind a VPN and that won't work in the CI pipeline or something like that. Think about the unique considerations for your project. So I would say start there and then start writing small tests. So you probably want to write small tests that work on your browser first. You want to ensure that those functionality work. And then you can add in things like cookies and APIs and databases.
Excellent answer. I think that's really important. Start exploring the product, start making sure that you understand what you actually need to automate, whether it fits. Of course, the suggestions are really valuable, but whether it fits your context is really very important to understand how we are going to design and how you're going to sequence your test as well, because this are going to be really very crucial. Thank you so much, Julia. I think it was a wonderful session. I'm sure these tips are going to help a lot of us here attending, and it was nice that you shared that with us. I took a lot of questions from our side as well. So thank you so much for being there. It was an honor to have you. Yes, stay tuned. We will share the recordings as well, so that you can have a look at it and see how you can optimize your projects. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you
you
for
so much.
having me.
Thank you so much, Julia. So thank you everyone for attending.